Deliberately here we avow ourselves, as he avowed himself, in the dock. Irishmen of one allegiance only. We of the Irish Volunteers and you others who are associated with us in today's task and duty are bound together and must henceforth stand together in brotherly union for the achievement of the freedom of Ireland. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they've intimidated half of us and purchased the other half. They think that they have foreseen.
Cool, aren't they? Sorry.
That's okay. You can talk. I don't think I'll use the audio for this. Or maybe I will because I just said that now.
I think this is everyone. So just to begin, I'll talk a bit about the early history of Glasnevin Cemetery. So the cemetery was founded in 1832 by Daniel O'Connell, and we'll be visiting his crypt just behind me in just a few minutes. But we do have 1.6 million buried in this cemetery, 124 acres in size.
Is there much more space?
Yes, there is 40 years worth of space left, and that's because many people these days are being cremated, of course. Every day in the chapel there behind you, we have funeral services, about 80% of which these days would be cremations. Cremations don't require the same amount of room as a traditional burial. That's a large part of the reason why we saw so much.
Landowners didn't really want to do with the money, so they just said, okay, let's just build a pyramid on our land. Down,
I'm going to move on to the bit around here, guys. The final resting place of Daniel O'Connell, the founder of Glasnevin Cemetery, and a man known even in his own day as one of the great political leaders of the 19th century, not just here in Ireland but also Europe as a whole. He was born in Carcaside, then in County Kerry, in 1775, and was educated as a young man in Cork and also in France. And while in France, he witnessed the violence of the French Revolution. And while he agreed with the principles of the revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, he was completely opposed to the use of violence to achieve political goals. Sorry, did I say good luck? I meant very bad luck, sorry.
Tap that coffin. He said it's good luck to tap the coffin. That's why I did it.
That people always say when they see this grave is the fact that it's such a small, humble headstone. Now there is a good reason for that, because it wasn't originally intended for himself. It was intended for the name right here, Brian de Valera, his young son, who was killed in a horse riding accident in the Phoenix Park. Chapel-like structure there, where we were standing at when we were listening to the reenactment. That's the Boland family mausoleum. So that was the family that owned Boland's Mills. And so it's one of those funny connections here in Glasnevin that they're buried only a stone's throw away from the man who seized control of their factory during the Easter Rising. So oftentimes in Glasnevin you will have opponents in life buried very close together in death. And that was the case with Eamon de Valera. Now, when the Rising ended, as one of the commanders of the rebellion, he was sentenced to death, although ultimately he wasn't executed. And there are many different reasons as to why. Would any of you be familiar with any of them? Yes, his citizenship. So he was born in the United States, in Manhattan, in New York. And because of that, the Rising took place during the First World War, at a time when the British government were trying to convince the Americans to join the war effort. And so it was felt that if they were to execute an American citizen, that wouldn't go down well with the government in the US. And so ultimately he wasn't executed. He was released the following year, 1917's general amnesty of Republican prisoners, and in 1918 led Sinn Féin to a landslide victory across the country. Instead of taking their seats in Westminster as a result of the 1918, including Sean Francis McEntee, who's buried in the headstone right there, the one that looks almost identical to De Valera's, his right-hand man in life, and now in death, you know, right behind him as well. He was his Taoiseach, or Deputy Prime Minister, during De Valera's time in government. Because De Valera went on to become Taoiseach, Deputy Prime Minister, Prime Minister, as we say here in Ireland, and toward the end of his life as well, Uachtar na hÉireann, President of Ireland. So a man whose career extended, as I say, throughout much of the 20th century, very influential figure in our history. Drafted our constitution, Glasnevin na hÉireann, in 1937 as well. So buried in this plot as well is his wife Sinead. Sinead De Valera was an author of children's stories. Here we are at the most visited grave, without any parallel here in Glasnevin Cemetery, the final resting place of Michael Collins. Michael Collins, of course, a very romantic figure in Irish history. These flowers placed on his grave every single day. They're not placed here by staff members in Glasnevin. No, they're placed here by members of the public throughout the year. Every single day, fresh flowers are placed on his grave. You can see there in the corner the American flags. They're sent over from an American lady in New York. And she's not an Irish American. She simply fell in love with Michael Collins and sent flowers over multiple times a year. She wants to remain anonymous though, so the little card that she sends over as well simply has "The Yank" written on it. There's also a mysterious French lady as well who watched the movie that was made of Michael Collins starring Liam Neeson. So it's entirely possible she fell in love with Liam Neeson rather than Collins. But you know, if you were here on Valentine's Day, for example, you'd be unable to see any stones on the grave with the amount of flowers, balloons, love hearts, teddy bears that people place on the grave of Michael Collins. His father was in his 60s when Collins was born. Said on his deathbed to the 8-year-old Collins, "You will be a great man, you will do great work for Ireland." As a teenager, Collins lived in London, where he became involved in various Gaelic organisations such as the GAA. And as a result of that, he became involved in revolutionary politics here. Now his family, they were Fenians in the 19th century, but it was only when over in London that Collins himself became involved in the struggle for Irish independence. In 1916, he fought in the Easter Rising in the GPO itself, and after the rising ended, he was sent over to Fronglock prison camp in Wales. But when anti-treaty forces seized control of the forecourts here in the city centre of Dublin, Collins, who had been content to leave them there and do nothing, was given an ultimatum by Winston Churchill himself, who said, either you remove these rebels from the forecourts or we will. And so the one thing that Collins feared above all else was the return of British forces to Ireland. He gave the controversial order to bombard the forecourts using British artillery. And these were the first shots of the Irish Civil War. 31-year-old Michael Collins, who had been killed by anti-treaty forces.
What she shot?
That's the big debate. Who knows? There's a lot of conspiracy theories about the death of Michael Collins. Now, I know the movie, if any of you have seen it, it would imply that Eamon De Valera was involved. Now, that's just, you know, there's no evidence for that, but, you know, it is Hollywood after all, you know, they have to make that rivalry even more dramatic. But Collins's funeral that was held in Glasnevin, just to give you an idea as to the amount of love and support that people had for him, an estimated 1/5 of the entire population of the country had turned out to pay their respects. An estimated 400,000 people lining the streets of Dublin. So large was the procession that by the time the coffin reached this spot right here, the back of the funeral procession was still in O'Connell Street.
I love the smell of French carpentry.
Yeah. Nice view of the city there. He's in a 360 like this.
You're in the dead centre of Dublin.
Tell us more about the dead centre.
My head's gonna look massive now.
It already does. Oh yeah, that is pretty big.
On
On a windy night. It's the sea up there, coast.
Yeah.
Super Marina Church. Yeah, you see the chimneys actually, so I can see that. Starfish.